Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Tehran. Coming up in this edition, Israel and Iran are launching a new wave of attacks against each other as tensions continue to mount in the region. The White House says US President Donald Trump will make a decision on whether to order a strike against Iran in the next 2 weeks. And the Chinese president is calling for deeper ties with New Zealand as the country's prime minister is on an official visit. We begin in the Middle East. The Iranian state news agency says the country has activated its air defense systems in response to attacks against Tehran. This comes as the Israel Defense Forces issued an evacuation warning in the Iranian region of Kalash Talashan. There have been loud explosions in the Iranian capital. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz says the military is intensifying strikes on strategic targets in Tehran to eliminate threats and destabilize the rule of Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Iran has also extended the closure of its airspace, with all civilian flights in and out of the country remaining suspended. Khamenei has vowed that the country will never surrender as Iran unleashes hypersonic missiles in the new wave of attacks against Israel. Iranian missiles have hit a hospital and residential buildings near Tel Aviv. Israeli health authorities say the attacks wounded over 270 people. Jonathan Regev reports from Tel Aviv.
It was perhaps quiet here in Tel Aviv, but not in other places. We know of a hit in one of the cities in the south, in a residential area, in residential buildings. At this time, we're speaking of damage, we're speaking of injuries, not of fatalities as far as we know. So the sirens have not sounded in Tel Aviv. They have sounded in other places in the country. There were twice sirens in northern Israel, as we mentioned, in southern Israel. Also constant alerts of UAVs, drones being intercepted. Israel said that the intentions were to take out or at least considerably slow down Iran's nuclear program and also take care of the ballistic missile program. No one spoke of regime change. No one spoke of eliminating the Iranian leader. This is something that Israel has not done in previous wars. Israel did not kill when there were wars with in the history with Syria, with Egypt. Israel did not look after the top leadership. Now, at least according to the defense minister, Israel may be doing it. The defense minister, Israel Katz, specifically naming Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the Iranian spiritual leader. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said, let's focus on the actions and not on the words. The fact that businesses have been practically shut down, even though some of them opened on Thursday, and there's no schools, and kids are at home, and everything is shut down, and the airport, for example, is shut down, and still more than 100,000 Israelis are stranded outside, and Israelis cannot leave the country. There's still support for all that, but to a certain extent, another week, another two, more than that, I think we'll start seeing the public losing patience. Israel.
That was Jonathan Regev reporting. While some residents in Tehran are seeking shelter in the north of the country, many have chosen to cross into neighboring Armenia for safety. Gayan Alexanian has more on the border situation.
In the past few days, we have seen hundreds of people crossing the border, entering into Armenia from Iran to this only border checkpoint Armenia and Iran have on the border. Actually, what information we have got so far, they are not entering Armenia as refugees. No such status has been granted so far. But what we actually know is that a lot of foreign nationals actually crossed into Armenia, and they use Armenia as a transit point to fly elsewhere. Among them were a lot of Chinese citizens. We talked to the mayor of a city nearby. He told that in the past few days, there have been a lot of foreign nationals, Iranian citizens, and also Iranian Armenians crossing the border. He claimed that, according to his estimates, only 30% were Iranian citizens. Most of them were foreign nationals, ethnic Armenians. Those ethnic Armenians usually have friends, businesses. Some of them even have houses here in Armenia. But what we know is that the Armenian government is getting prepared for a scenario when there will be a huge influx of refugees into Armenia.
That was Gayan Alexanian reporting. Turning to the U.S., the White House says U.S. President Donald Trump will make a decision on whether to order a strike against Iran in the next 2 weeks. Meantime, the Israeli Defense Forces says 14 aircraft carrying military equipment have arrived in Israel from the U.S. A third U.S. Navy destroyer has entered the eastern Mediterranean Sea, and a second U.S. carrier strike group is heading towards the Arabian Sea. The Pentagon says the moves are defensive. Jim Spellman has more from Washington, D.C.
He has repeatedly said he's still deciding and that he may not decide until the last second. But Trump remains confident that a deal can be struck with Iran over the country's nuclear program, and so he is holding off on military action, at least for now. Listen.
Regarding the ongoing situation in Iran, I know there has been a lot of speculation amongst all of you in the media regarding the president's decision-making and whether or not the United States will be directly involved. In light of that news, I have a message directly from the president, and I quote, "Based on the fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks."
So what would a deal look like? Well, Trump has repeatedly said that in his view, Iran cannot be allowed to acquire a nuclear weapon. And the White House says any deal would require Iran to stop enriching uranium. The White House also says Trump's lead negotiator remains in touch with Iranian officials, but the White House wouldn't provide any more details about potential communications. President Trump's supporters and advisors have been split between the America First base that does not want the U.S. involved in foreign wars and the more traditional hawkish wing of the Republican Party. Many in that faction have been pushing Trump to get involved militarily. But they've also been keeping a close eye on the Strait of Hormuz. This is a vital passage between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, then into the Arabian Sea. About 20 million barrels of oil flow through the strait every day. That's about a quarter of the world's oil supply. If it's blocked by Iranian forces, it could rock the global economy. So in addition to these potential military targets, civilian targets, the Pentagon is keeping a close eye on what is happening there in the Strait of Hormuz and has been moving more U.S. naval warships into the region.
That was Jim Spellman reporting. In neighboring Mexico, cleanup work is underway after Hurricane Eric hit the country's Pacific coast. The Category 3 hurricane weakened to a tropical storm as it moved across southern Mexico. Alastair Baverstock has more from Mexico City.
The first major hurricane of 2025 in the eastern Pacific, Eric, described as extremely dangerous, made landfall during the early hours of Thursday as a Category 3 storm. With sustained wind speeds of over 200 kilometers per hour, it struck an area of Oaxaca state inhabited by more than 1.5 million people, many of whom had evacuated prior to the storm's arrival. At her morning press conference, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum said locals had largely heeded the warnings to seek shelter.
The public has reacted very well up until now, and we expect that to continue as the after effects of the hurricane begin.
Mexico's government says those after effects include an ocean storm surge possibly as high as 1.5 meters and multiple rivers bursting their banks, causing life-threatening flooding and landslides in a marginalized region of this country. Over 30,000 military personnel have been deployed throughout the area to coordinate the hurricane response. At the start of Mexico's 2025 hurricane season, Eric is the earliest major hurricane ever recorded to make landfall on this country's Pacific coast, a region which has been badly impacted by more extreme weather in recent years. Eric came ashore about 160 kilometers east of Acapulco, making this the third year in a row that the Mexican beach resort has been impacted by a major hurricane. And with an above-average season predicted this year, it may not be the last.
That was Alastair Baverstock reporting. And finally, in China, Chinese President Xi Jinping has called for further development of China-New Zealand relations as their comprehensive strategic partnership enters a new decade. He made the remarks while meeting with New Zealand Prime Minister Christopher Luxon in Beijing. Luxon is on an official visit to China from Tuesday to Friday, his first visit to the country since taking office. President Xi says China-New Zealand relations have withstood global changes over their decades of diplomatic ties. Li Dongning has more details.
President Xi Jinping called for joint efforts to drive greater development over the next 10 years. And President Xi said the two sides should prioritize complementary advantages, deepen trade and investment, and enhance cooperation in areas such as scientific and technological innovation, climate change response, and people-to-people exchanges. And he also called on both nations to jointly safeguard the UN-centered international system and multilateral trading mechanism. And Luxon said relations with China are of great significance, reaffirming the One China policy and commitment to expanding trade, investment, and cooperation. It said the international community expects China to play a key role in helping to safeguard trade multilateralism and resolve global challenges. Prime Minister Luxon is leading a business delegation from multiple sectors, which arrived in Shanghai on Wednesday. And in 2024, trade between China and New Zealand reached $22.86 billion, with China accounting for 20.6% of New Zealand's total exports, supporting over 100,000 jobs. And China remains a key market for New Zealand across several sectors, consuming 31% of the country's dairy exports, 61% of its timber, and 24% of its meat.
That was Li Dongning reporting. Recapping today's headlines, Israel and Iran are launching a new wave of attacks against each other as tensions continue to mount in the region. The White House says the US president will make a decision on whether to order a strike against Iran in the next 2 weeks. And the Chinese president is calling for deeper ties with New Zealand as the country's prime minister is on an official visit. That's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports, and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a 1-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Meng Tang. Thank you for listening.